Start by thinking about the Greek myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a human being, a mortal human being, but he got in trouble with the gods. And the gods punished Sisyphus by requiring him to roll a very large, heavy rock up a hill every day. And when he rolled the rock up to the top of the hill, there was a brief pause, and then the rock would roll back down, and Sisyphus would have to go back down over and over again, endlessly, rolling the rock up and down the hill. Think about that life and what its features are that kind of bother us. One is it's repetitive, it's boring, doesn't involve any creativity, and also there's no product at the end, no lasting accomplishment or product. Think now about a contemporary version, perhaps, of Sisyphus. The example comes from a contemporary philosopher, Susan Wolf. It's the Blob. The Blob sits on his couch every day, pretty much all day with little breaks, and he watches sitcoms on TV. TV is his only thing, his life. And maybe he also gets a six-pack of beer from time to time and regularly drinks the beer. Beer and sitcoms, and that's it. He's a bit like Sisyphus in that his life is extremely repetitive. We would find it boring. He also has no lasting accomplishment. There's no creativity in his life. And if you step back a little from these cases where we would say there's meaninglessness or there's not a lot of meaning in those lives, you could ask the question, how are our lives really different from those? How is my life different from Sisyphus or the Blob? Because all of our lives involve repetition. For instance, well, there are lives with greater and lesser repetition, but some people have to go to a job in a cubicle every day, doing the same thing day after day with no creativity. Some people have to go to a call center. Some people have to work in a factory where they're doing the same specific task every day, hour after hour, day after day. Even those of us who live more creative lives, more flexible lives, have certain cycles and patterns in our lives. You get up, you brush your teeth, you go to school, you go to your job, you go home, you cook dinner, maybe you read, maybe you watch TV, maybe you talk to your family, and then you repeat it again the next day. And looked at from a distance, you could say, zooming out and reflecting on our lives, they look a lot like Sisyphus. They can look a lot like the Blob. The details are going to be different, but there is repetition. There's not as much creativity, perhaps, as we'd like. And frequently, there's no lasting accomplishment. So what I'd like to do is explore these issues a little more, and in the background, I want us to be thinking about how, if at all, our lives are different from, let's say, the Blobs or Sisyphus. There's a question that we can think about that is a very difficult one to grasp or to get our mind around, and that is, what's the meaning of life? It's this big question, what's the meaning of life? Sometimes when I introduce myself at a party or at a wedding as a philosophy professor, the first thing someone asks is, okay, tell me what the meaning of life is. We all kind of think of it as a joke. And in a way, it's a joke in the sense that it's impossible to answer in a way that everyone will agree with. And there probably is no single meaning to all our lives. The way I think of it, to make a little progress on this question, is each of us has a meaning to our lives. It's not that the species has a meaning, and it's not that the meaning of all our lives is the same, but each of us has a meaning. And I think it's fruitful and instructive to think of the meaning of each of our lives as the story of our lives, the narrative we tell through our actions. Metaphorically, you could say our free actions are sentences in the narrative of our lives. Our free actions are sentences in the narratives of our lives. We tell our own story. Now, it might be unwieldy to think of the meaning of our life in terms of the story in all its detail, but you could think of it as a précis or a summary of the narrative of our lives. That's the meaning of our life. Or maybe you could analyze the summary of our life in terms of its main themes. So, thinking about it this way, we can make sense of the idea of the question, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of my life? It's my life story, or the themes of my life story. But it's also important to keep in mind that a good story is not necessarily the story of a good life. A good story in the telling, a novel, a short story, a film, the plot of a film, doesn't necessarily depict a highly meaningful life, the kind of life that we want to strive for. So I want to talk now or think about not so much the meaning of my life, but what makes a life meaningful. One of the main ideas is the religious idea that what makes a life meaningful is fulfilling God's purpose for me, fulfilling God's mission for me. This is perhaps the basic idea of the religious orientation toward value. One of the challenges, though, for this view is to try and figure out what God's purpose for me is. How do I understand that? I can pray, I can read the scriptures, depending on which particular religion I accept, but there will still be a challenge to figure out exactly what God has selected for me. And the challenge will be almost the same as someone who takes a more secular approach, doesn't believe in God. We all have to figure out what specific activities and relationships endow our life with greater meaning or lesser. And that point, I should pause for a second and point out that meaningfulness in life is not all or nothing. It's not as though we have a meaningful life or not. Meaningfulness is scalar in the sense that it works like a scale. You can have degrees of meaningfulness, just like you can weigh a slightly different amount every time you get on the scale. So some lives we think of, when we reflect as a group, we think of as more meaningful, some we think of as less meaningful. Perhaps someone who counts the blades of grass in his front lawn every day, and does nothing, no further reflection, maybe that's not a very meaningful life. Maybe someone who goes to Dodger Stadium every evening or every time there's a game and counts the light bulbs in the stanchions. That's all he does. He doesn't see the game, he doesn't reflect in any other way, doesn't even have a Dodger dog. He just counts the light bulbs. Our consensus view is there might be some meaningfulness there, but not a lot. So we have these views about more and less meaningfulness. The religious view is the supremely meaningful life is acting in accordance with God's purpose for us, but we still have to figure out what that purpose is. So stepping back from a more religious orientation, because not everyone accepts the existence of a God, we might reflect on the ideas that we have about meaningfulness enhancing activities and those that diminish it. Those that diminish it seem to be, again, boredom, repetition, no lasting accomplishment, no creativity, the kind of life Sisyphus had to lead and the blob leaves. But for us, what enhances meaningfulness, at least many people think this, one of the most important ideas we have about meaningfulness in life is connecting with something greater than ourselves, linking to something of value and not just being trapped in ourselves, connecting with something greater than ourselves. But now we have to figure out what are the specific ways in which we can do that to make our lives more meaningful. And again, one of the central key ideas here is love, deep friendship, working together with other people as a team, with a shared project, with colleagues at work, with teammates on an athletic team. In all of these ways, we reach out to other people and we achieve something of value by linking to these other people in deep, deep ways. So connecting with God is one way to reach out to something greater than ourselves, but that's not the only way. We can, for instance, in designing a building or performing a piece of music or, for instance, writing poetry or writing a novel, we can, again, connect to the great histories of music and art and fiction. We can write poetry. We can raise a family. That's another way, of course, of reaching out to something greater than me, to really love someone. All of these are ways, and I'm just giving you some examples, of course, all of these are ways of avoiding the prison of myself and connecting with someone else, with something greater than myself, with an ongoing activity. And these are the sorts of things that we typically think of as giving our lives more meaning. So think again, let's go back. Let's go back to Sisyphus and the blob. One of the problems in the way in which we typically think of Sisyphus is that he's trapped. His attention, his consciousness is just on the rock. And he has no ability to reach out to something greater than himself. He's connected with something larger than himself, but it's the rock. It's not something of value. We think of meaningfulness as connecting with something of value. And think of the blob. He's connected to the TV set and to the couch, but again, we don't think of those as things of value. Meaningfulness is enhanced by linking with value. So that's the way we think of those lives that makes us think they're not very meaningful. But we can think of them in a different way as well. Albert Camus, the great French existentialist, writer, philosopher of the 20th century, discussed Sisyphus, and he actually called Sisyphus the absurd hero. Why was he absurd? Well, because he was working so hard to roll this rock up the hill, but when he got to the top of the hill, he could see that it was pointless. There wasn't any point to what he was doing, no lasting accomplishment. Maybe if he brought the rocks up there and built a cathedral or a building, that would have a point. But his life, he was just trapped in his repetition. Maybe the blob is that way too. He really doesn't, he doesn't do anything else. He has no lasting accomplishment. His life is entirely repetitious and he's trapped in himself. But we can think, what's really important is we can think of these lives in a different way. We can, Sisyphus was a hero according to Camus because he didn't have to be trapped, and he wasn't trapped just in his absurd, repetitious life. What happened was when he got to the top of the hill, he had some time to pause and reflect and take a broader view of things. And as he did that, he actually decided not to accept the judgment, the negative judgment of the gods, and he used his mind to carve out his own identity. He scorned the gods, he defied the gods. And that's something that I think is important. It's crucial to remember that we always have the freedom of our mind, the freedom to transcend the trap of our repetitious lives or our repetitious activities. This is brought out by Viktor Frankl in his work on the meaning of life. He said that man, he should have said people, are meaning-seeking individuals. We're meaning-seeking animals. We can find meaning in almost any circumstance. He specifically focused on concentration camps, and he talked about the different ways in which the people who were treated so cruelly and horribly in concentration camps could find meaningful activities even in that context. Some actually had orchestras, small orchestras or small musical groups in which they found ways to transcend their horrible lives in the concentration camps and find meaning. So Sisyphus was a hero in transcending or escaping from his prison, and the Blob could do that as well. The Blob could enjoy the sitcoms and learn from them, learn about human nature, learn about human relationships and families. So he would not be imprisoned by his repetitious life, but he would be using it as a platform for transcending, for enlightenment, for learning about life. What I want to say then, I want to say that our lives don't have to be prisons, no matter how repetitious they are. When we think of life as a prison, as focusing all our energy, all our attention, our mind just on what we're doing, that's where we lose meaningfulness. That's where the story of our life becomes the story of a less meaningful individual. But when we can use our lives not as prisons, but as platforms for seeking a connection with something greater than ourselves, for seeking insights into human nature, for exercising the distinctive capacity that we human beings have for free will, then I think that's where meaningfulness comes. You could say our activities can become platforms for something greater, for making those connections, and we're not imprisoned in ourselves. I want to end by thinking about a Buddhist monk, a Zen Buddhist monk. Perhaps the monk's life is extremely repetitive. He chants, he meditates, he prays every day, all day, with short breaks. There's really no creativity there, at least looking at it from the outside, and there's no lasting accomplishment. And yet we think that a Zen Buddhist monk of this sort could lead a deeply meaningful life. And so how exactly is that life different from Sisyphus in a prison or the Blob in the prison of his repetitious activities? The Zen Buddhist monk lives a repetitious life. But the point is, the mantras, the chanting, the prayer, the idea is to focus the mind not on oneself ultimately. Maybe you start there, but the whole goal is to achieve a kind of enlightenment. So it's the prayers, the repetition, are a platform for something greater, for connecting with truths, deep truths, fundamental truths about the universe. It's a platform, not a prison. I think that's what makes our life meaningful, no matter how repetitious it is. Even if you're in the worst of circumstances like a concentration camp, we still have the freedom to transcend. We may not have as much freedom as we'd like. Our lives might be constrained and limited in their meaningfulness. They may be less meaningful than someone else's. But as long as our attention and our totality of our being is not trapped, is not imprisoned, then we can achieve the kind of meaningfulness that we all aspire to, connecting with something greater than ourselves.